Chapter 4. General Portfolio Policy. The Defensive Investor. The basic characteristics of an investment portfolio are usually determined by the position and characteristics of the owner or owners. At one extreme, we have had savings, banks, life insurance, companies, and so-called legal trust funds. A generation ago there, investments were limited by law in many states to high-grade bonds and, in some cases, high-grade preferred stocks at the other extreme. We have the well-to-do and experienced businessman who will include any kind of bond or stock in his security list provided he considers it an attractive purchase. It has been an old and sound principle that those who can't afford to take risks should be content with a relatively low return on their invested funds. From this, there has developed the general notion that the rate of return which the investor should aim for is more or less proportionate to the degree of risk he is ready to run. Our view is different. The rate of return sought should be dependent rather on the amount of intelligent effort the investor is willing and able to bring to bear on his task. The minimum return goes to our passive investor, who wants both safety and freedom from concern. The maximum return would be realized by the alert and enterprising investor who exercises maximum intelligence and skill. In 1965, we added, in many cases, there may be less real risk associated with buying a bargain issue offering the chance of a large profit than with a conventional bond purchase, yielding about 4%. This statement had more truth in it than we ourselves suspected, since in subsequent years, even the best long-term bonds lost a substantial part of their market value because of the rise in interest rates. TT. The basic problem of bond stock allocation we have already outlined in briefest form, the portfolio policy of the defensive investor. He should divide his funds between high-grade bonds and high-grade common stocks. We have suggested as a fundamental guiding rule that the investor should never have less than 25% or more than 75% office funds in common stocks, with a consequent inverse range of between 75% and 25% in bonds. There is an implication here that the standard division should be an equal one, or 50-50, between the two major investment mediums. According to tradition, the sound reason for increasing the percentage in common stocks would be the appearance of the bargain price levels created in a protracted bear market. Conversely, sound procedure would call for reducing the common stock component below 50% when, in the judgment of the investor, the market level has become dangerously high. These copybook maxims have always been easy to enunciate and always difficult to follow because they go against that very human nature which produces that excesses of bull and bear markets. It is almost a contradiction in terms to suggest as a feasible policy for the average stock owner that he lighten his holdings when the market advances beyond a certain point and add to them after a corresponding decline. It is because the average man operates, and apparently must operate, in opposite fashion that we have had the great advances and collapses of the past, and this writer believes we are likely to have them in the future, if the division between investment and speculative operations were as clear now as once it was. We might be able to envisage investors as a shrewd, experienced group who sell out to the heedless, hapless speculators at high prices and buy back from them at depressed levels. This picture may have had some verisimilitude in bygone days, but it is hard to identify it with financial developments since 1949. There is no indication that such professional operations as those of the mutual funds have been conducted in this fashion. The percentage of the portfolio held in equities by, if, as we have long believed, the stock market with its old bounds, and if new ones have not yet been established, then we can give the investor no reliable rules by which to reduce his common stock holdings toward the 25% minimum and rebuild them later to the 75% maximum. We can urge that in general, the investor should not have more than 1/2 in equities unless he has strong confidence in the soundness of his stock position and is sure that he could view a market decline of the 1969 to 70 type with equanimity. It is hard for us to see how such strong confidence can be justified at the levels existing in early 1972. Thus, we would counsel against a greater than 50% apportionment to common stocks at this time, But for complementary reasons, it is almost equally difficult to advise a reduction of the figure well below 50%, unless the investor is disquieted in his own mind about the current market level, and will be satisfied also to limit his participation in any further rise to, say, 25% of his total funds. We are thus led to put forward for most of our readers what may appear to be an oversimplified 50-50 formula. Under this plan, the guiding rule is to maintain as nearly as practicable an equal division between bond and stock holdings. When changes in the market level have raised the common stock component to, say, 55%, the balance would be restored by a sale of 1/11 of the stock portfolio and the transfer of the proceeds to bonds. Conversely, a fall in the common stock proportion to 45% would call for the use of 1/11 of the bond fund to buy additional equities. Yale University followed a somewhat similar plan for a number of years after 1937, but was geared around a 35% normal holding in common stocks. In the early 1950s, however, Yale seems to have given up its once famous formula, and in 1969 held 61% of its portfolio in equities, including some convertibles. At that time, the endowment funds of 71 such institutions, totaling $7.6 billion, held 60.3% in common stocks. The Yale example illustrates the almost lethal effect of the great market advance upon the once popular formula approach to investment. Nonetheless, we are convinced that our 50-50 version of this approach makes good sense for the defensive investor. It is extremely simple. It aims unquestionably in the right direction. It gives the follower the feeling that he is at least making some moves in response to market developments. Most important of all, it will restrain him from being drawn more and heavily into common stocks as the market rises to more and dangerous heights. Furthermore, a truly conservative investor will be satisfied with the gains shown on half his portfolio in a rising market. While in a severe decline, he may derive much solace from reflecting how much better off he is than many of his more venturesome friends. While our proposed 50-50 division is undoubtedly the simplest all-purpose program devisable, it may not turn out to be the best in terms of results achieved. Of course, no approach, mechanical or otherwise, can be advanced with any assurance that it will work out better than another. The much larger income return now offered by good bonds than by representative stocks is a potent argument for favoring the bond component. The investor's choice between 50% or a lower figure in stocks may well rest mainly on his own temperament and attitude. If he can act as a cold-blooded weigher of the odds, he would be likely to favor the low 25% stock component at this time, with the idea of waiting until the DJI dividend yield was, say, 2/3 of the bond yield before he would establish his median 50-50 division between bonds and stocks. Starting from $900 for the DJIA and dividends of $36 on the unit, this would require either a fall in taxable bond yields from 7% to about 5.5% without any change in the present return on leading stocks, or a fall in the DJIA to as low as 660 if there is no reduction in bond yields and no increase in dividends. A combination of intermediate changes could produce the same buying point. A program of that kind is not especially complicated. The hard part is to adopt it and to stick to it, not to mention the possibility that it may turn out to have been much too conservative. The bond component, the choice of issues in the bond component of the investors. Portfolio will turn about two main questions. Should he buy tax-able or tax-free bonds, and should he buy shorter or longer term maturities? The tax decision should be mainly a matter of arithmetic, turning on the difference in yields as compared with the investor's tax bracket. In January 1972, the choice. In May 20th, 2024, maturi. Ties was between obtaining, say, 7% on grade LA, corporate, bonds, and 5.3% on prime. Tax-free issues. The term, municipals, is generally applied to all species of tax-exempt bonds, including state obligations. There was, thus for this maturity, a loss in income of some 30% in passing from the corporate to the municipal field. Hence, if the investor was in a maximum tax bracket higher than 30%, he would have a net saving after taxes by choosing Munich. IPOB bonds, the opposite, if it's maximum. Tax was less than 30% a single person starts paying, a 30% rate when his income after deductions passes $10,000. 4. A married couple, the rate applies when combined taxable income passes $20,000. It is evident that a large proportion of individual investors would obtain a higher return after taxes from good municipals than from good corporate bonds. The choice of longer versus shorter maturities involves quite a different question, viz. Does the investor want to assure himself against a decline in the price of his bonds, but at the cost of 1, a lower annual yield, and 2, loss of the possibility of an appreciable gain in principal value? We think it best to discuss this question in Chapter 8, The Investor and Market Fluctuations. For a period of many years in the past, the only sensible bond purchases for individuals were the U.S. savings issues. Their safety was and is unquestioned. They gave a higher return than other bond investments of first quality. They had a money-back option and other privileges which added greatly to their attractiveness. In our earlier editions, we had an entire chapter entitled U.S. Savings Bonds, a Boon to Investors. As we shall point out, U.S. savings bonds still possess certain unique merits that make them a suitable purchase by any individual investor. For the man of modest capital with, say, not more than $10,000 to put into bonds, we think they are still the easiest and the best choice. But those with larger funds may find other mediums more desirable. Let us list a few major types of bonds that deserve investor consideration and discuss them briefly with respect to general description, safety, yield, market price, risk, income tax status, and other features. 1. U.S. Savings Bonds, Series E and Series H. We shall first summarize their important provisions and then discuss briefly the numerous advantages of these unique, attractive, and exceedingly convenient investments. The Series H bonds pay interest semi-annually, as do other bonds. The rate is 4.29% for the first year and then a flat 5.10% for the next 9 years to maturity. Interest on the Series E bonds is not paid out, but accrues to the holder through increase in redemption value. The bonds are sold at 75% of their face value and mature at 100% in 5 years, 10 months after purchase. If held to maturity, the yield works out at 5%, compounded semi-annually. If redeemed earlier, the yield moves up from a minimum of 4.01% in the first year to an average of 5.20% in the next 4 years. Interest on the bonds is subject to federal income tax, but is exempt from state income tax. However, federal income tax on the Series E bonds may be paid at the holder's option either annually. As the interest accrues through higher redemption value or not, until the bond is actually disposed of. Owners of Series E bonds may cash them in at any time, shortly after purchase, at their current redemption value. Holders of Series H bonds have similar rights to cash them in at par value, cost. Series E bonds are exchangeable for Series H bonds with certain tax advantages. Bonds lost, destroyed, or stolen may be replaced without cost. There are limitations on annual purchases, but liberal provisions for co-ownership by family members make it possible for most investors to buy as many as they can afford. Comment: there is no other investment that combines 1. Absolute assurance of principal and interest payments, 2. The right to demand full money back at any time, and 3. Guarantee of at least a 5% interest rate for at least 10 years. Holders of the earlier issues. Off series. E-bonds have had the right to extend their bonds at maturity, and thus to continue to accumulate annual values at successively higher rates. The deferral of income tax payments over these long periods has been of great dollar advantage. We calculate it has increased the effective net after-tax rate received by as much as a years of low cost price or better as given the purchasers. In former interest rates, complete protection against the shrinkage in Princey pal value that befell many bond investors. Otherwise stated, it gave them trustor switching their low interest holdings into very high coupon issues on an even money basis. In our view, the special advantages enjoyed by owners of SAV. Ing's bonds now will more than compensate for their lower current return as compared with other direct government obligations. 2. Other United States bonds. A profusion of these issues exists, covering a wide variety of coupon rates and maturity. Dates. All of them are completely safe with respect to payment of interest. And principal. They are subject to federal income taxes but free from state income tax. In late 1971, the long-term issues over 10 years showed an average yield of 6.09%. Intermediate issues 3 to 5 years returned 6.35%, and short issues returned 6.03%. In 1970, it was possible to buy a number of old issues at large discounts. Some of these are accepted at par in settlement of estate taxes. Example, the U.S. Treasury 31 seconds due 1990 are in this category. They sold at 60 in 1970, but closed 1970 above 77. It is interesting to note also that in many cases, the indirect obligations of the U.S. government yield appreciably more than its direct obligations of the same maturity. As we write, an offering appears of 7.05% of certificates fully guaranteed by the Secretary of Transportation of the Department of Transportation of the United States. The yield was fully 1% more than that on direct obligations of the U.S., maturing the same year, 1986. The certificates were actually issued in the name of the trustees of the Penn Central Transportation Company, but they were sold on the basis of a statement by the U.S. Attorney General that the guarantee brings into being a general obligation of the United States backed by its full faith and credit. Quite a number of indirect obligations of this sort have been assumed by the U.S. government in the past, and all of them have been scrupulously honored. The reader may wonder why all this hocus pocus involving an apparently personal guarantee by our Secretary of Transportation, and a higher cost to the taxpayer in the end. The chief reason for the indirection has been the debt limit imposed meant borrowing by the Congress. Apparently, guarantees by the government are not regarded as debts, a semantic windfall for shrewder investors. Perhaps the chief impact of this situation has been the creation of tax-free housing authority bonds, enjoying, ungoverned, the equivalent of a U.S. guarantee, and virtually the only tax-exempt issues that are equivalent to government bonds. Another type of government-backed issues is the recently created new community debentures, offered to yield 7.60% in September 1971. 3. State and municipal bonds. These enjoy exemption from federal income tax. They are also ordinarily free of income tax in the state of issue, but not elsewhere. They are either direct obligations of a state or subdivision, or revenue bonds dependent for interest payments on receipts from a toll road, bridge, building lease, etc. Not all tax-free bonds are strongly enough protected to justify their purchase by a defensive investor. He may be guided in his selection by the rating given to each issue by Moody's or Stan. DART and DAMP, PORS, one of 3 highest ratings by both services, AAA, AA, AA, or A, should constitute a sufficient indication of adequate safety. The yield on these bonds will vary both with the quality and the maturity, with the shorter maturities giving the lower return. In late 1971, the issues represented in Standard and DAMP. POR's Municipal Bond Index averaged AA in quality rating, 20 years in maturity, and 5.78% in yield. A typical offering of Vineland NJ bonds rated AA for A and gave a yield of only 3%. On the 1-year maturity, rising to 5.8% to the 1995 and 1996 MIT2. RIDIES.14. Corporation bonds. These bonds are subject to both federal and state tax. In early 1972, those of highest quality yielded 7.19% for a May 25, 2024 maturity, as reflected in the published yield of Moody's AAA Corporate Bond Index. The so-called lower medium grade issues, rated BA, returned 8.23% for long maturities. In each class, shorter-term issues would yield somewhat less than longer-term obligations. Comment. The above summaries indicate that the average investor has several choices among high-grade bonds. Those in high income tax brackets can undoubtedly obtain. A better net yield from good tax-free issues than from taxable ones. For others, the of taxable yield would seem to be from 5% on. Early 1972 range U.S. savings bonds, with their special options, to about 7% on high-graded corporate issues. Higher yielding bond investments, by sacrificing quality an investor can obtain a higher income return from his bonds. Long experience has demonstrated that the ordinary investor is wiser to keep away from such high yield bonds. While taken as a whole, they may work out somewhat in terms of overall return than the first quality issues. They expose the owner to too many individual risks of untoward developments, ranging from disquieting price declines to actual default. It is true that bargain opportunities occur fairly often in lower grade bonds, but these require special study and skill to exploit successfully. Perhaps we should add here that the limits imposed by Congress on direct bond issues of the United States have produced at least two sorts of bargain opportunities for investors in the purchase of government-backed obligations. One is provided by the tax-exempt new housing issues, and the other by the recently created taxable new community debentures. An offering of new housing issues in July 1971 yielded as high as 5.8%, free from both federal and state taxes, while an issue of taxable new community debentures sold in September 1971 yielded 7.60%. Both obligations have the full faith and credit of the United States government behind them, and hence are safe without question. And on a net basis, they yield considerably more than ordinary United States bonds. Savings deposits in lieu of bonds. An investor may now obtain as high an interest rate from a savings deposit in a commercial or savings bank, or from a bank certificate of deposit, as he can from a first-grade bond of short ma. The interest rate on bank savings accounts may be lowered in the future, but under present conditions they are a suitable substitute for short-term bond investment by the individual. Convertible issues. These are discussed in Chapter 16. The price variability of bonds in general is treated in Chapter 8, the investor and market fluctuations. Call provisions. In previous editions, we had a fairly long discussion of this aspect of bond financing, because it involved a serious but little noticed injustice to the investor. In the typical case, bonds were callable fairly soon after issuance, and at modest premiums, say 5% above the issue price. This meant that during a period of wide fluctuations in the underlying interest rates, the investor had to bear the full brunt of unfavorable changes and was deprived of all but a meager participation in favorable ones. Example. Our standard example has been the issue of American Gas and Electric 100-year 5% debentures sold to the public at 101 in 1928. 4 years later, under near-panic conditions, the price of these good bonds fell to 62%, yielding 8%. By 1946, in a great rever, Sal bonds of this type could be sold to yield only 3%, and the 5% issue should have been quoted at close to 160. But at that point, the company took advantage of the call provision and redeemed issue at a mere 106. The call feature in these bond contracts was a thinly disguised instance of heads I win, tails you lose. At long last, the bond buying institutions refused to accept this unfair arrangement. In recent years, most long-term high coupon issues have been protected against redemption for 10 years or more. After issuance, this still limits their possible price rise, but not inequitably. In practical terms, we advise the investor in long-term issues to sacrifice a small amount of yield to obtain the assurance of non-callability, say for 20 or 25 years. Similarly, there is an advantage in buying a low coupon bond at a discount rather than a high bond selling at about par and callable in a few years. The discount, e.g. of a 3 bond at 63% yielding 7.85 carries full protection against adverse collaction coupon. Straight, i.e. non-convertible preferred stocks. 2. 4. Certain general observations should Be made here on the subject of preferred stocks. Really good preferred stocks can and do exist, but they are good in spite of their investment form, which is an inherently bad one. The typical preferred shareholder is dependent of a company pay for his safety on the ability and desire of the dens on its common stock. Once the common dividends are omitted, or even in danger, his own position becomes precarious. 4. The directors are under no obligation to continue paying him unless they also pay on the common. On the other hand, the typical preferred stock carries no share in the company's profits beyond the fixed dividend rate. Thus, the preferred holder lacks both the legal claim of the bondholder or creditor and the profit possibilities of a common shareholder or partner. These weaknesses in the legal position of preferred stocks tend to come to the fore recurrently in periods of depression. Only a small percentage of all preferred issues are so strongly entrenched as to maintain an unquestioned investment status through all vicissitudes. Experience teaches that the time to buy preferred stocks is when their price is unduly depressed by temporary adversity. At such times, they may be well suited to the aggressive investor but too unconventional for the defensive investor. In other words, they should be bought on a bargain basis or not at all. We shall refer later to convertible and similarly privileged issues which carry some special possibilities of profits. The seer, not ordinarily selected for a conservative portfolio. Another peculiarity in the general position of preferred stocks, corpora, deserves mention. They have a much better tax status for Sean buyers than for individual investors. Corporations pay income tax on only 15% of the income they receive in dividends, but on the full amount of their ordinary interest income. Since the 1972 corporate rate is 48%, this means that $100 received as preferred stock. Dividends is taxed only $7.20, whereas $100 received as bond interest is taxed $48. On the other hand, individual investors pay exactly the same tax on preferred stock investments as on bond interest, except for a recent minor exemption. Thus, in strict logic, all investment-grade preferred stocks should be bought by corporations, just as all tax-exempt bonds should be bought by investors who pay income tax. Security forms, the bond form and the preferred stock form, as hitherto discussed, are well understood and relatively simple matters. A bondholder is entitled to receive fixed interest and payment of principal on a definite date. The owner of a preferred stock is entitled to a fixed dividend and no more, which must be paid before any common dividend. His principal value does not come due on any specified date. The dividend may be cumulative or non-cumulative. He may or may not have a vote. The above describes the standard provisions and no doubt the majority of bond and preferred issues, but there are innumerable departures from these forms. The best known types are convertible and similar issues, and income bonds. In the latter type, interest does not have to be paid unless it is earned by the company. Unpaid interest may accumulate as a charge against future earnings, but the period is often limited to 3 years. Income bonds should be used by corporations much more, 200, extensively than they are. Their avoidance, apparently, arises from a mere accident of economic history, namely that they were first employed in quantity in connection with railroad reorganizations, and hence they have been associated from the start with financial weakness and poor investment status. But the form itself has several practical advantages, especially in comparison with and in substitution for the numerous convertible preferred stock issues of recent years. Chief of these is the deductibility of the interest paid from the company's taxable income, which in effect cuts the cost of that form of capital in half. From the investor's standpoint, it is probably best for him in most cases that he should have 1. An unconditional right to receive interest payments when they are earned by the company, and 2. A right to other forms of protection than bankruptcy proceedings if interest is not earned and paid. The terms of income bonds can be tailored to the advantage of both the borrower and the lender in the manner best suited to both. Conversion privileges can, of course, be included. The acceptance by everybody of the inherently weak preferred stock form and the rejection of the stronger income bond form is a fascinating illustration of the way in which traditional institutions and habits often tend to persist on Wall Street despite new conditions calling for a fresh point of view. With every new wave of optimism or pessimism, we are ready to abandon history and time-tested principles, but we cling tenaciously and unquestioningly to our prejudices. Commentary on Chapter 4. When you leave it to chance, then all of a sudden you don't have any more luck. Basketball coach Pat Riley. How aggressive should your portfolio be? That, says Graham, depends less on what kinds of investments you own than on what kind of investor you are. There are two ways to be an intelligent investor. By continually researching, selecting, and monitoring a dynamic mix of stocks, bonds, or mutual funds, or by creating a permanent portfolio that runs on autopilot and requires no further effort, but generates very little excitement. Graham calls the first approach active or enterprising. It takes lots of time and loads of energy. The passive or defensive strategy takes little time or effort, but requires an almost ascetic detachment from the alluring hullabaloo of the market. As the investment thinker, Charles Ellis has explained, the enterprising approach is physically and intellectually taxing, while the defensive approach is emotionally demanding. Fan and relish a complicated intellectual challenge. Then the active, if you have time to spare, are highly competitive, think like a sports. Commentary on Chapter 4. Approach is up your alley if you always feel rushed, crave simplicity, and don't relish thinking about money, then the passive approach is for you. Some people will feel most comfortable combining both methods, creating a portfolio that is mainly active and partly passive, or vice versa. Both approaches are equally intelligent, and you can be successful with either, but only if you know yourself well enough to pick the right one. Stick with it over the course of your investing lifetime. And keep your costs and emotions under control. Graham's distinction between active and passive investors is another of his reminders that financial risk lies not only where most of us look for it in the economy or in our investments, but also within ourselves. Can you be brave or will you cave? How then should a defensive investor get started? The first and most basic decision is how much to put in stocks and how much to put in bonds and cash. Note that Graham deliberately places this discus. See on after his chapter on inflation, forearming you with the knowledge that inflation is one of your worst enemies. The most striking thing about Graham's discussion of how to allocate your assets between stocks and bonds is that he never mentions the word age that sets his advice firmly against the winds of conventional wisdom, which holds that how much investing risk you ought to take depends mainly on how old you are. A traditional rule of thumb was to subtract your age from 100 and invest that percentage of your assets in stocks with the rest in bonds or cash. A 28-year-old would put 72% of her money in stocks. An 81-year-old would put only 19% there. Like everything else, these assumptions got overheated in the late 1990s. By 1999, a popular book argued that if you were younger than 30, you should put 95% of your money in stocks, even if only a moderate tolerance for risk 3 you had. Unless you've allowed the proponents of this advice to subtract 100% from your IQ, you should be able to tell that something is wrong here. Why should your age determine how much risk you can take? An 89-year-old with $3 million, an ample pension, and a gaggle of grandchildren would be foolish to move most of her money into bonds. She already has plenty of income, and her grandchildren, who will eventually inherit her stocks, have decades of investing ahead of them. On the other hand, a 25-year-old who is saving for his wedding and a house down payment would be out of his mind to put all his money in stocks. If the stock market takes an Acapulco high dive, he will have no bond income to cover his downside or his backside. What's more, no matter how young you are, you might suddenly need to yank your money out of stocks, not 40 years from now, but 40 minutes from now. Without a whiff of warning, you could lose your job, get divorced, become disabled, or suffer who knows what other kind of surprise. The unexpected can strike anyone at any age. Everyone must keep some assets in the riskless haven of cash. Dollar. Finally, many people stop investing precisely because the stock market goes down. Psychologists have shown that most of us do a very poor job of predicting today how we will feel about an emotionally charged event in the future. When stocks are going up 15% or 20% a year, as they did in the 1980s and 1990s, it's easy to imagine that you and your stocks are married for life. But when you watch you invested getting bashed down to a dime, it's hard to resist bailing out into the safety of bonds and cash, instead of buying and holding their stocks. Many people end up buying high, selling low, and holding nothing but their own head in their hands. Because so few investors have the guts to cling to stocks in a falling market, Graham insists that everyone should keep a minimum of 25% in bonds. That cushion, he argues, will give you the courage to keep the rest of your money in stocks even when stocks stink. To get a better feel for how much risk you can take, think about the fundamental circumstances of your life, when they will kick in, when they might change, and how they are likely to affect your need for cash. Are you single or married? What is your spouse or partner do for a living? Do you or will you have children? When will the tuition bills hit home? Will you inherit money? Or will you end up financially responsible for aging, ailing parents? What factors might hurt your career? If you work for a bank or a home builder, a jump in interest rates could put you out of a job. If you work for a chemical manufacturer, soaring oil prices could be bad news. If you are self-employed, how long do businesses similar to yours tend to survive? Do you need your investments to supplement your cash income? In general, bonds will, stocks won't. Given your salary and your spending needs, how much money can you afford to lose on your investments? If, after considering these factors, you feel you can take the higher risks inherent in greater ownership of stocks, you belong around Graham's minimum of 25% in bonds or cash. If not, then steer mostly clear of stocks, edging toward Graham's maximum of 75% in bonds or cash. To find out whether you can go up to 100%, see the sidebar on P105. Once you set these target percentages, change them only as your life circumstances change. Do not buy more stocks because the stock market has gone up. Do not sell them because it has gone down. The very heart of Graham's approach is to replace guesswork with discipline. Fortunately, through your 401k, it's easy to put your portfolio on permanent autopilot. Let's say you are comfortable with a fairly high level of risk, say 70% of your assets in stocks and 30% in bonds. If the stock market rises 25%, but bonds stay steady, you will now have just under 75% in stocks and only 25% in bonds. Visit your 401k's website or call its toll-free number and sell enough of your stock funds to rebalance back to your 70 minus 30 target. The key is to rebal. And on a predictable, patient schedule, not so often that you will. Why not 100% stocks? Graham advises you never to have more than 75% of your total assets in stocks, but is putting all your money into the stock market inadvisable for everyone? For a tiny minority of investors, a 100% stock portfolio may make sense. You are one of them. If you have set aside enough cash to support your family for at least 1 year, will be investing steadily for at least 20 years to come, survive the bear market that began in 2000s. Did not sell stocks during the bear market that began in 2000s. Bought more stocks during the bear market that began in 2000s. Have read chapter 8 in this book and implemented a formal plan to control your own investing behavior. Unless you can honestly pass all these tests, you have no business putting all your money in stocks. Anyone who panicked in the last bear market is going to panic in the next one and will regret having no cushion of cash and bonds. Drive yourself crazy, and not so seldom that your targets will get out of whack. I suggest that you rebalance every 6 months, no more, and no less, on easy-to-remember dates like New Year's and the 4th of July. The beauty of this periodic rebalancing is that it forces you to base your investing decisions on a simple, objective standard: do I now own more of this asset than my plan calls for, instead of the sheer guesswork of where interest rates are heading, or whether you think the Dow is about to drop dead. Some mutual fund companies include ET.Rowe Price, may soon introduce services that will automatically rebalance your 401k portfolio to your preset targets, so you will never need to make an active decision. w.leo.org. The ins and outs of income investing in Graham's day. Bond investors face two basic choices: taxable or tax-free, short-term or long-term. Today there is a third: bonds or bond funds, taxable or tax-free. Unless you're in the lowest tax bracket, you should buy only tax-free municipal bonds outside your retirement accounts. Otherwise, too much of your bond income will end up in the hands of the IRS. The only place to own taxable bonds is inside your 401k or another sheltered account, where you will owe no current tax on their income and where municipal bonds have no place, since their tax advantage goes to waste. Short-term or long-term, bonds and interest rates teeter on opposite ends of a seesaw. If interest rates rise, bond prices follow, though a short-term bond falls far less than a long-term bond. On the other hand, if interest rates fall, bond prices rise and a long-term bond will outperform shorter ones. You can split the difference simply by buying intermediate-term bonds maturing in 5 to 10 years, which do not soar when their side of the seesaw rises, but do not slam into the ground either. For most investors, intermediate bonds are the simplest choice, since they enable you to get out of the game of guessing what interest rates will do. Bonds or bond funds. Since bonds are generally sold in $10,000 lots, and you need a bare minimum of 10 bonds to diversify away the risk that any one of them might go bust, buying individual bonds makes no sense unless you have at least $100,000 to invest. The only exception is bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury, since they are protected against default by the full force of the American government. Bond funds offer cheap and easy diversification, along with the convenience of monthly income, which you can reinvest right back into the fund at current rates without paying a commission. For most investors, bond funds beat individual bonds hands down. The main exceptions are Treasury securities and some municipal bonds. Major firms like Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab, and T. Rowe Price offer a broad menu of bond funds at low cost. 9. The choices for bond investors have proliferated like rabbits, so let's update Graham's list of what's available. As of 2003, interest rates have fallen so low that investors are starved for yield. But there are ways of amplifying your interest income without taking on excessive risk. 10-figure Formulas 1 summarizes the pros and cons. Now let's look at a few types of bond investments that can fill special needs. Cash is not trash. How can you wring more income out of your cash? The intelligent investor should consider moving out of bank certificates of deposit or money market accounts, which have offered meager returns. Lately, Tom, of these cash alternatives: Treasury securities, as obligations of the U.S. government, carry, notes, de-purchase directly, purchase through a mutual fund. Ease of sale before maturity indicates how readily you can sell at a fair price before maturity date. Mutual funds typically offer better ease of sale than individual bonds. Money market funds are federally insured up to $100,000 if purchased at an FDIC member bank, but otherwise carry only an implicit pledge not to lose value. Federal income tax on savings bonds is deferred until redemption or maturity. Municipal bonds are generally exempt from state income tax only in the state where they were issued. Narrate: virtually no credit risk, since instead of defaulting on his debts, Uncle Sam can just jack up taxes or print more money at will. Treasury bills mature in 4, 13, or 26 weeks because of their very short maturities. T-bills barely get dented when rising interest rates knock down the prices of other income investments. Longer-term Treasury debt, however, suffers severely when interest rates rise. The interest income on Treasury securities is generally free from state, but not federal income tax. And with $3.7 trillion in public hands, the market for Treasury debt is immense, so you can readily find a buyer if you need your money back before maturity. You can buy Treasury bills, short-term notes, and long-term bonds directly from the government with no brokerage fees at www.publicdebt.trias.gov. For more on inflation-protected tips, see the commentary on Chapter 2. Savings bonds, unlike Treasuries, are not marketable. You cannot sell them to another investor, and you'll forfeit 3 months of interest if you redeem them in less than 5 years. Thus, they are suitable mainly as set-aside money to meet a future spending need, a gift for a religious ceremony that's years away, or a jump start on putting your newborn through Harvard. They come in denominations as low as $25, making them ideal as gifts to grandchildren. For investors who can confidently leave some cash untouched for years to come, inflation-protected I bonds recently offered an attractive yield of around 4%. To learn more, see www.savingsbonds.gov. Moving beyond UNCLESAM, mortgage securities, pooled together from thousands of more gauges around the United States. These bonds are issued by agencies like the Federal National Mortgage Association, Fannie Mae, or the Government National Mortgage Association, Ginnie Mae. However, they are not backed by the U.S. Treasury, so they sell at higher yields, reflect their greater risk. Mortgage bonds generally underperform when interest rates fall and bomb when rates rise. Over the long run, swings tend to even out and the higher average yields pay off. Good mortgage bond funds are available from Vanguard, Fidelity, and PIMCO. But if a broker ever tries to sell you an individual mortgage bond or CMO, tell them you are late for an appointment with your proctologist. Those annuities. These insurance-like investments enable you to defer current taxes and capture a stream of income after you retire. Fixed annuities offer a set rate of return. Variable ones provide a fluctuating return. But what the defensive investor really needs to defend against here are the hard-selling insurance agents, stockbrokers, and financial planners who peddle annuities at rapaciously high costs. In most cases, the high expenses of owning an annuity, including surrender charges that gnaw away at your early withdrawals, will overwhelm its advantages. The few good annuities are bought, not sold. If an annuity produces fat commissions for the seller, chances are it will produce meager results for the buyer. Consider only those you can buy directly from providers with rock bottom costs like Emeritus, TAACREF, and Vanguard.11. Preferred stock. Preferred shares are a worst of both worlds investment. They are less secure than bonds since they have only a secondary claim on a company's assets if it goes bankrupt. And they offer less profit potential than common stocks do, since companies typically call or forcibly buy back their preferred shares when interest rates drop or their credit rating improves. Unlike the interest payments on most of its bonds, an issuing company cannot deduct preferred dividend payments from its corporate tax bill. Ask yourself, if this company is healthy enough to deserve my investment, why is it paying a fat dividend on its preferred stock instead of issuing bonds and getting a tax break? The likely answer is that the company is not healthy, the market for its bonds is glutted, and you should approach its preferred shares as you would approach an unrefrigerated dead fish. Ever. Common stock. A visit to the stock screener at http:// yahoo.com/stocks.html and early showed that of the stocks in the Standard & Poor's 500 index had dividend yields of 3% or greater. No intelligent investor, no matter how starved for yield, would buy a stock for its dividend income alone. The company and its businesses must be solid, and its stock price must be reasonable. But thanks to the bear market that began in 2000s, some leading out-yielding treasury bonds. So even the most defensive investor should realize that selectively adding stocks to an all bond or mostly bond portfolio can increase its income, yield, and raise stocks are now its potential return. 12. Chapter 5. The Defensive Investor and Common Stocks. Investment Merits of Common Stocks in our first edition, 1949. We found it necessary at this point to insert a long exposition of the case for including a substantial common stock component in all investment portfolios. Common stocks were generally viewed as highly speculative and therefore unsafe. They had declined fairly substantially from the high levels of 1946. But instead of attracting investors to them because of their reasonable prices, this fall had had the opposite effect of undermining confidence in equity securities. We have commented on the converse situation that has developed in the ensuing 20 years, whereby the big advance in stock prices made them appear and profitable investments at record high levels, which might actually carry with them a considerable degree of safe. The argument we made for common stocks in 1949 turned on www.lo.org, Two main points. The first was that they had offered a considerable degree of protection against the erosion of the investor's dollar caused by inflation, whereas bonds offered no protection at all. The second advantage of common stocks lay in their higher average return to investors over the years. This was produced both by an average dividend income exceeding the yield on good bonds and by an underlying tendency for market value to increase over the years in consequence of the reinvestment of undistributed profits. While these two advantages have been of major importance and have given common stocks a far better record than bonds over the long-term past, we have consistently warned that these benefits could be lost by the stock buyer if he pays too high a price for his shares. This was clearly the case in 1929, and it took 25 years for the market level to climb back to the ledge from which it had abysmally fallen in 1929 to 1932. Since 1957, common stocks, again, through their high prices, lost their traditional advantage in dividend yield over bond interest rates. It remains to have once, 114, be seen whether the inflation factor in the economic growth fact will make up in the future for this significantly adverse development. It should be evident to the reader that we have no enthusiasm for common stocks in general at the 900 DJIA level of late 1971. For reasons already given, we feel that the defensive investor cannot afford to be without an appreciable proportion of common stocks in his portfolio, even if he must regard them as the lesser of two evils, the greater being the risks attached to an all-bond holding. Rules for the common stock component. The selection of common stocks for the portfolio of the defensive investor should be a relatively simple matter. Here we would sug. Just 4 rules to be followed. 1. There should be adequate, though not excessive, diversification. This might mean a minimum of 10 different issues and a maximum of about 30 T2. Each company selected should be large, prominent, and conservatively financed. Indefinite, as these adjectives must be. Their general sense is clear. Observations on this point are added at the end of the chapter. 3. Each company should have a long record of continuous dividend payments. All the issues in the Dow Jones Industrial Age met this dividend requirement in 1971. To be specific on this point, we would suggest the requirement of continuous dividend payments beginning at least in 1950. 4. The investor should impose some limit on the price he will pay for an issue in relation to its average earnings over, say, the past 7 years. We suggest that this limit be set at 25 times such average earnings, and not more than 20 times those of the last 12-month period. But such a restriction would eliminate nearly all the strongest and most popular companies from the portfolio. In particular, it would ban virtually the entire category of growth stocks, which have for some years past been the favorites of both speculators and institutional investors. We must give our proposing so drastic an exclusion reasons for growth stocks, and the defensive investor at the term growth stock is applied to one which has increased its per share earnings in the past at well above the rate for common stocks generally and is expected a continuado do so in the future. Some authorities would say that a true growth stock should be expected at least to double its per share earnings in 10 years, i.e. to increase them obviously stocks of this kind are attractive to buy and to own provided the price paid is not excessive. The problem lies there of compounded annual rate of over 7.1%. Of course, since growth stocks have long sold at high prices in relation to current earnings and at much higher multiples of their average profits over a past period, this has introduced a speculative element of considerable weight in the growth stock picture and has made successful operations in this field a far from simple matter. The leading growth issue has long been international business machines, and it has brought phenomenal rewards to those who bought it years ago and held on to it tenaciously. But we have already pointed out that this best of common stocks actually lost 50% of its market price in this 6 months decline during 1961 to 62, and nearly the same percentage in 1969 to 70. Other growth stocks have been even more vulnerable to adverse developments. In some cases, not only has the price fallen back, but the earnings as well, thus causing a double discomfiture to those who own them. A good second example for our purpose is Texas Instruments, which in 6 years rose from 5 to 256 without paying a dividend while its earnings increased. From 40 cents to $3.91 per share. Note that the price advanced 5 times as fast as the profits. This is characteristic of popular common stocks. But 2 years later, the earnings dropped off by nearly 50% and the price by 4/5 to 49. The reader will understand from these instances why we growth stocks as a whole is too uncertain and risky the defensive investor. Of course, wonders can be accomplished with the right individual selections. Bought at the right levels, A later sold after a huge rise and before the probable decline. But average investor can no more expect to accomplish this than to money growing on trees. In contrast, we think that the group had regard vehicle, find of. 4. Large companies that are relatively unpopular and therefore obtainable at reasonable earnings multipliers offers a sound if unspectacular area of choice by the general public. We shall illustrate this idea in our chapter on portfolio selection. Portfolio changes. It is now standard practice to submit all security lists for periodic inspection in order to see whether their quality can be improved. This, of course, is a major part of the service provided for clients by investment counselors. Nearly all brokerage houses are ready to make corresponding suggestions without special fee in return for the commission business involved. Some brokerage houses maintain investment services on a fee basis. Presumably, our defensive investor should obtain at least once a year the same kind of advice regarding changes in his portfolio Asha sought when his funds were first committed. Since he will have a little expertness of his own on which to rely, it is essential that he entrust himself only to firms of the highest reputation, otherwise he may easily fall into incompetent or unscrupulous hands. It is important, in any case, that at every such consultation he make clear to his advisor that he wishes to adhere closely to the 4 rules of common stock selection given earlier in this chapter. Incidentally, if his list has been competently selected, in the first instance, there should be no need for frequent or numerous changes. Dollar cost averaging. The New York Stock Exchange has put considerable effort into popularizing its monthly purchase plan, under which an investor devotes the same dollar amount each month to buying 1 or more common stocks. This is an application of a special type of formula investment known as dollar cost averaging. During the predominantly rising market experience since 1949, the results from such a procedure were certain to be highly satisfactory, especially since they prevented the practitioner from concentrating his buying at the wrong times. In LaSalle Tomlinson's comprehensive study of formula investment plans, the author presented a calculation of the results of dollar cost averaging in the group of stocks making up the Dow Jones Industrial Index. Tests were made covering 23 10-year purchase periods, the first ending in 1929, the last in 1952. Every test showed a profit either at the close of the purchase period or within 5 years thereafter. The average indicated profit at the end of the 23 buying periods was 21.5%, exclusive of dividends received. Needless to say, in some instances there was a substantial temporary depreciation at market value. Ms. Tomlinson ends her discussion of this ultra-simple investment formula with the striking sentence, "No one has yet discovered any other formula for investing which can be used with so much confidence of ultimate success, regardless of what may happen to security prices, as dollar cost averaging." It may be objected that dollar cost averaging, while sound in principle, is rather unrealistic in practice, because few people are so situated that they can have available for common stock investment the same amount of money each year for, say, 20 years. It seems to me that this apparent objection has lost much of its force in recent years. Common stocks are becoming generally accepted as a necessary component of a sound savings investment program. Thus, systematic and uniform purchases of common stocks may present no more psychological and financial difficulties than similar continuous payments for United States savings bonds and for life insurance, to which they should be complementary. The monthly amount may be small, but the results after 20 or more years can be impressive and important. To the saver, the investor's personal situation. At the beginning of this chapter, we referred briefly to the posy, Sean the individual portfolio owner. Let us return to this matter in the light of our subsequent discussion of general policy. To what extent should the type of securities selected by the investor vary? With his circumstances, as concrete examples representing widely different conditions, we shall take 1. A widow left $200,000 with which to support herself and her children. 2. A successful doctor in mid-career with savings of $100,000 and yearly accretions of $10,000. And 3. A young man earning $200 per week and saving $1. 0,000 a year. For the widow, the problem of living on her income is a very difficult one. On the other hand, the need for conservatism in her investments is paramount. A division of her fund about equally between United States bonds and first-grade common stocks is a compromise between these objectives and corresponds to our general prescription for the defensive investor. The stock component may be placed as high as 75% if the investor is psychologically prepared for this decision and if she can be almost certain she is not buying at too high a level. Assuredly, this is not the case in early 1972, as we do not preclude the possibility that the widow may qualify. Enterprising investor, in which case her objectives and methods will be quite different. The one thing the widow must not do is to take speculative chances in order to make some extra income. By this we mean trying for profits or high income without the NEC, or equipment to warrant full confidence in overall success. Will be far better for her to draw $2,000 per year out off her prin, Sapal, in order to make both ends meet, than to risk half of it in poorly grounded, and therefore speculative, ventures. The prosperous doctor has none of the widow's pressures and compulsions. Yet we believe that his choices are pretty much the same. Is he willing to take a serious interest in the business of investment? If he lacks the impulse or the flair, he will do best to 120, accept the easy role of the defensive investor. The division of his portfolio should then be no different from that of the typical widow, and there would be the same area of personal choice in fixing the size of the stock component. The annual savings should be invested in about the same proportions as the total fund. The average doctor may be more likely than the average widow to elect to become an enterprising investor, and he is perhaps more likely to succeed in the undertaking. He has one important handy, however, the fact that he has less time available to give to his investment education and to the administration of his funds. In fact, medical men have been notoriously unsuccessful in their security dealings. The reason for this is that they usually have an ample confidence in their own intelligence and a strong desire to make a good return on their money, without the realization that to do so successfully requires both considerable attention to the matter and something of a professional approach to security values. Finally, the young man who saves $1,000 a year and expects to do better gradually finds himself with the same choices, though for still different reasons. Some of his savings should go automatically into Series E bonds. The balance is so modest that it seems hardly worthwhile for him to undergo a tough educational and temperamental discipline in order to qualify as an aggressive investor. Thus, a simple resort to our standard program for the defensive investor would be at once the easiest and the most logical policy. Let us not ignore human nature at this point. Finance has a fascination for many bright young people with limited means. They would like to be both intelligent and enterprising in the placement of their savings, even though investment income is much less important to them than their salaries. This attitude is all to the good. There is a great advantage for the young capitalist to begin his financial education and experience early. If he is going to operate as an aggressive investor, he is certain to make some mistakes and to take some losses. Youth can stand these disappointments and profit by them. Urge the beginner in security buying waste his efforts and his money in trying to beat the market. Let him study security values and initially test out his judgment price versus value with the smallest possible sums. Thus, we return to the statement made at the outset that the ILE kind of securities to be purchased and the rate of return to be sought depend not on the investor's financial resources, but on his financial equipment in terms of knowledge, experience, and temperament. Note on the concept of risk. It is conventional to speak of good bonds as less risky than good preferred stocks, and of the latter as less risky than good common stocks. From this was derived the popular prejudice against common stocks because they are not safe, which was demonstrated in the Federal Reserve Board survey of 1948. We should like to point out that the words risk and safety are applied to securities in two different senses, with a resultant confusion in thought. A bond is clearly proved unsafe when it defaults its interest or principal payments. Similarly, if a preferred stock or even a common stock is bought with the expectation that a given rate of dividend will be continued, then a reduction or passing of the dividend means that it has proved unsafe. It is also true that an investment contains a risk if there is a fair possibility that the holder may have to sell at a time when the price is well below cost. Nevertheless, the idea of risk is often extended to apply to a possible decline in the price of a security. Even though the decline may be of a cyclical and temporary nature, and even though the holder is unlikely to be forced to sell at such times. These chances are present in all securities other than United States savings bonds, and to a greater extent in the general run of common stocks than in senior issues as a class. But we believe that what is here involved is not a true risk in the useful sense of the term. The man who holds A were forced to sell it at an unfavorable time. That element is not. On a building might have to take a substantial loss if he, taken into account in judging the safety or risk of ordinary real estate mortgages. The only criterion being the certainty of punctual payments. In the same way, the risk attached to an ordinary commercial business is measured by the chance of its losing money, not by what would happen if the owner were forced to sell. Mortgage. In Chapter 8, we shall set forth our conviction that the bona fide investor does not lose money merely because the market price of his holdings declines, hence the fact that a decline may occur does. 122. The intelligent investor, a group Bothwell, not mean that he is running a true risk of loss. If selected common stock investments shows a satisfactory overall return, as measured through a fair number of years, then this group investment has proved to be safe. During that period, its market value is bound to fluctuate, and as likely as not, it will sell for a while under the buyer's cost. If that fact makes the investment risky, it would then have to be called both risky and safe at the same time. This confusion may be avoided if we apply the concept of risk solely to a loss of value which either is realized through actual sale or is caused by significant deterioration in the company's position, or more frequently perhaps, is the result of the payment of an excessive price in relation to the intrinsic worth of the security. But too many common stocks do involve risks of such deterioration. But it is our thesis that a properly executed group investment in common stocks does not carry any substantial risk of this sort, and that therefore it should not be termed risky merely because of the element of price fluctuation. But such risk is present if there is danger that the price may prove to have been clearly too high by intrinsic value standards, even if any subsequent severe market decline may be recouped many years later. Note on the category of large, prominent, and conservatively financed corporations. The quoted phrase in our caption was used earlier in the chapter to describe the kind of common stocks to which defensive investors should limit their purchases, provided also that they had paid continuous dividends for a considerable number of years. A criterion based on adjectives is always ambiguous. Where is the dividing line for size, for prominence, and for conservatism of financial structure? On the last point, we can suggest a specific standard that, though arbitrary, is in line with accepted thinking. N. Industrial companies' finances are not conservative unless the common stock at book value represents at least half of the total capitalization, including all bank debt. For a railroad or public utility, the figure should be at least 30%. The words large and prominent carry the notion of substantial size combined with a leading position in the industry. Such companies are often referred to as primary. All other common stocks are then called secondary, except that growth stocks are ordinarily placed in a separate class by those who buy them as such. To supply an element of concreteness here, let us suggest that total large in present-day terms, a company should have $50 million of assets or do $50 million of business. Again, to be prominent, a company should rank among the first quarter or first third in size within its industry group. It would be foolish, however, to insist upon such arbitrary criteria. They are offered merely as guides to those who may ask for guidance. But any rule which the investor may set for himself and which does no violence to the common sense meanings of large and prominent should be acceptable. By the very nature of the case, there must be a large group of companies that some will, and others will not include among those suitable for defensive. Invest. Meant. There is no harm in such diversity of opinion and action. In fact, it has a salutary effect upon stock market conditions because it permits a gradual differentiation or transition between the Kate, Gorey's primary and secondary stock issues. Commentary on Chapter 5. Human felicity is produced not so much by great pieces of good fortune that seldom happen, as by little advantages that occur every day. Benjamin Franklin. The best defense is a good offense. After the stock market bloodbath of the past few years, why would any defensive investor put a dime into stocks? First, remember Graham's insistence that how defensive you should be depends less on your tolerance for risk than on your willingness to put time and energy into your portfolio. And if you go about it the right way, investing in stocks is just as easy as parking your money in bonds and cash. As we'll see in Chapter 9, you can buy a stock market index fund with no more effort than it takes to get dressed in the morning. Amidst the bear market that began in 2000s, it's understandable if you feel burned, and if in turn that feeling makes you determined never to buy another stock again. As an old Turkish proverb says, after you burn your mouth on hot milk, you blow on your yogurt, because the crash of 2000s to 2002 was so terrible. Many investors now view stocks as scaldingly risky, but paradoxically, the very act of crashing has taken much of the risk out of the stock market. It was hot milk before, but it is room temperature yogurt now. Viewed logically, the decision of whether to own stocks today has nothing to do with how much money you might have lost by owning them a few years ago. When stocks are priced reasonably enough to give you future growth, then you should own them, regardless of the losses they may have cost you in the recent past. That's all the more true when bond yields are producing investments, low, reducing the future returns on income. 121. As we have seen in Chapter 3, stocks are, as of early 2003, only mildly overpriced by historical standards. Meanwhile, at recent prices, bonds offer such low yields that an investor who buys them for their supposed safety is like a smoker who thinks he can protect himself against lung cancer by smoking low-tar cigarettes. No matter how defensive an investor you are, in Graham's sense of low maintenance, or in the contemporary sense of low risk, today's values mean that you must keep at least some offer money in stocks. Fortunately, it's never been easier for a defensive investor to buy stocks. And a permanent autopilot portfolio which effortlessly puts a little bit of your money to work every month in predetermined investments can defend you against the need to dedicate a large part of your life to stock picking. Should you buy what you know? But first, let's look at something the defensive investor must always defend against: the belief that you can pick stocks without doing any homework. In the 1980s and early 1990s, one of the most popular investing slogans was, "Buy what you know." Peter Lynch, who from 1977 through 1990 piloted Fidelity Magellan to the best track record ever compiled by a mutual fund, was the most charismatic preacher of this gospel. Lynch argued that amateur investors have an advantage that professional investors have forgotten how to use: the power of common knowledge. If you discover a great new restaurant, car, toothpaste, or jeans, or if you notice that the parking lot at a nearby business is always full, or that people are still working at a company's headquarters, long after Jay Leno goes off the air, then you have a personal insight into a stock that a professional analyst or portfolio manager might never pick up on. As Lynch put it, during a lifetime of buying cars or cameras, you develop a sense of what's good and what's bad, what sells and what doesn't. And the most important part is, you know it before Wall Street knows it. By investing in companies or industries you already understand isn't Lynch's rule. You can outperform the experts if you use your edge. Commentary on Chap. Totally implausible, and thousands of investors have profited from it over the years. But Lynch's rule can work only if you follow its corollary. As well, finding the promising company is only the first step. The next step is doing the research. To his credit, Lynch insists that no one should ever invest in a company, no matter how great its products or how crowded its parking lot, without studying its financial statements and estimating its business value. Unfortunately, most stock buyers have ignored that part. Barbra Streisand, the day trading diva, personified the way people abuse Lynch's teachings. In 1999, she burbled, "We go to Starbucks every day, so I buy Starbucks stock." But the funny girl forgot that no matter how much you love those tall, skinny lattes, you still have to analyze Starbucks' financial statements and make sure the stock isn't even more overpriced than the coffee. Countless stock buyers made the same mistake by loading up on shares of Amazon.com because they loved the website or buying E-Trade stock because it was their own online broker. Experts gave the idea credence too. In an interview televised on CNN in late 1999, portfolio manager Kevin Landis of the First Hand Funds was asked plaintively, "How do you do it?" "Why can't I do it, Kevin?" From 1995 through the end of 1999, the First Hand Technol OG Value Fund produced an astounding 58.2% average annualized gain. "Well, you can do it," Landis chirped. "All you really need to do is focus on the things that you know and stay close to and talk to people who work in it every day to industry." And the most painful perversion of Lynch's rule occurred in corporate retirement plans. If you're supposed to buy what you know, then what could possibly be a better investment for 401k than your own company stock? After all, you work there. Don't you know more about the company than an outsider ever could? Sadly, the employees of Enron, Global Crossing, and WorldCom, many of whom put nearly all their retirement assets in their own company's stock, only to be wiped out, learned that insiders often possess only the illusion of knowledge, not the real thing. Psychologists led by Baruch Fischhoff of Carnegie Mellon University have documented a disturbing fact. Becoming more familiar with a subject does not significantly reduce people's tendency to exaggerate how much they actually know about it. 3. That's why investing in what you know can be so dangerous. The more you cake, the less likely you are to probe a stock for weaknesses. This pernicious form of overconfidence is called home bias, or the habit of sticking to what is already familiar. Individual investors own 3 times more shares in their local phone company than in all other phone companies combined. The typical mutual fund owns stocks whose headquarters are 115 miles closer to the fund's main office than the average US.com. Pani is 401k investors keep between 25% and 30% of their retirement assets in the stock of their own company. In short, familiarity breeds complacency. On the TV news, isn't it? Always the neighbor or the best friend or the parent of the criminal who says in a shocked voice, "He was such a nice guy." That's because whenever we are too close to someone or something, we take our beliefs for granted, instead of questioning them as we do when we can. Likely a Tisto turn a defensive investor into a lazy one who thinks theirs. Front something more remote. The more familiar a stock is, the more. No netto, do any homework. Don't let that happen to you. Can you roll your own? Fortunately for a defensive investor who is willing to do the required homework for assembling a stock portfolio. This is the golden age. Never before in financial history has owning stocks been so cheap and convenient. Dive. Do it yourself through specialized online brokerages like www.sharebuilder.com, www.foliofn.com, and www.buyandhold.com. You can buy stocks automatically even if you have very little cash to spare. These websites charge as little as $4 for each periodic purchase of any of the thousands of US stocks they make available. You can invest every week or every month, reinvest the dividends, and even trickle your money into stocks through electronic withdrawals from your bank account or direct deposit from your paycheck. ShareBuilder charges more to sell than to buy, reminding you like a little whack across the nose with a rolled up newspaper. That rapid selling is in investing, while Folio FN offers an excellent tax tracking tool. unlike traditional brokers or mutual funds that won't let you in the door for less than $2,000 or $3,000. These online firms have no minimum account balances and are tailor-made for beginning investors who want to put fledgling portfolios on autopilot. To be sure, a transaction fee of $4 takes a monstrous 8% bite out of a monthly investment, but if that's all the money you can spare, then these micro-investing sites are the only game in town for building a diversified portfolio. You can also buy individual stocks straight from the issuing compa. NECs. In 1994, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission lose. In the handcuffs it had long ago clamped on the direct sale of stocks to the public. Hundreds of companies responded by creating internet-based programs allowing investors to buy shares without going through a broker. Some helpful online sources of information on buying stocks directly include www.dripcentral.com, www.netstock.direct.com, an affiliate of ShareBuilder, and www.stockpower.com. You may often incur a variety of nuisance fees that can exceed $25 per year. Even so, direct stock purchase programs are usually cheaper than stockbrokers. Be warned, however, that buying stocks in tiny increments for years on end can set off big tax headaches. If you are not prepared to keep a permanent and exhaustively detailed record of your purchases, do not buy in the first place. Finally, don't invest in only one stock or even just a handful of different stocks. Unless you are not willing to spread your bets, you shouldn't bet at all. Graham's guideline of owning between 10 and 30 stocks remains a good starting point for investors who want to pick their own stocks, but you must make sure that you are not overexposed to one industry. For more on how to pick the individual stocks that will make up your portfolio, see pp. 114-115 and chapters 11, 14, 15. If after you set up such an online autopilot portfolio, you find yourself trading more than twice a year or spending more than an hour or 2 per month total on your investments, then something has gone badly wrong. Do not let the ease and up-to-the-minute feel of the internet seduce you into becoming a speculator. A defensive investor runs and wins the race by sitting still. Get some help. A defensive investor can also own stocks through a discount broker, a financial planner, or a full-service stockbroker. At a discount brokerage, you'll need to do most of the stock picking work yourself. Graham's guidelines will help you create a core portfolio requiring minimal maintenance and offering maximal odds of a steady return. On the other hand, if you cannot spare the time or summon the interest to do it yourself, there's no reason to feel any shame in hiring someone to pick stocks or mutual funds for you. But there's one responsibility that you must never delegate. You, and no one but you, must investigate before you hand over your money whether an advisor is trustworthy and charges reasonable fees. For more point here, see Chapter 10. Farm it out. Mutual funds are the ultimate way for a defensive investor to capture the upside of stock ownership without the down commentary on Epi Alpha Hoyota Sigma Iota or side of having to police your own portfolio. At a relatively low cost, you can buy a high degree of diversification and convenience, letting a professional pick and watch the stocks for you in their finest form. Index portfolios, mutual funds can require virtually no monitoring maintenance whatsoever. Index funds are a kind of Rip Van Winkle investment that is highly unlikely to cause any suffering or surprises, even if, like Washington Irving's lazy farmer, you fall asleep. For 20 years, they are a defensive investor's dream come true. For more detail, see Chapter 9. Filling in the potholes as the financial markets heave and crash their way up and down day after day, the defensive investor can take control of the chaos. Your very refusal to be active, your renunciation of any pretended ability to predict the future can become your most powerful weapons by put self-delusion. Ting every investment decision on autopilot, you drop any that you know where stocks are headed, and you take away the market's power to upset you, no matter how bizarrely it bounces. As Graham notes, dollar cost averaging enables you to put a fixed amount of money into an investment at regular intervals. Every week, month, or calendar quarter, you buy more, whether the markets have gone or are about to go up, down, or sideways. Any major mutual fund company or brokerage firm can automatically and safely transfer the money electronically for you, so you never have to write a check or feel. The conscious pang of payment. It's all out of sight, out of mind. The ideal way to dollar cost average is into a portfolio of index funds, which own every stock or bond worth having. That way, you renounce not only the guessing game of where the market is going, but which sectors of the market and which particular stocks or bonds within them will do the best. Let's say you can spare $500 a month by owning and dollar cost averaging into just 3 index funds, negative $300 into one that holds the total US stock market, $100 into one that holds foreign stocks, and $100 into one that holds US bonds. You can ensure that you own almost every investment on the planet that's worth owning. Every. T-U-Inga, Foreman or Inkle. Phrases. 20% more. Month, like clockwork, you buy more. If the market has dropped, your preset amount goes further, buying you more shares than the month before. If the market has gone up, then your money buys you fewer shares. By putting your portfolio on permanent autopilot this way, you prevent yourself from either flinging money at the market just when it seems most alluring and is actually most dangerous, or refusing to buy more after a market crash has made investments truly cheaper, but seemingly more risky. IUT0. According to Ibbotson Associates, the leading financial research firm, if you had invested $12, 0.0000 in the Standard & Poor's 500 stock index at the beginning of September 1929. 10 years later, you would have had only $7,223 left. But if you had started with a paltry $100 and simply invested another $100 every single month, then by August 1939, your money would have grown to $15,571. That's the power of disciplined buying, even in the face of the Great Depression and the worst bear market of all time. Figure 5-1 shows the magic of dollar cost averaging in a more recent bear market. Best of all, once you build a permanent autopilot portfolio with index funds as its heart and core, you'll be able to answer every market question with the most powerful response a defensive investor could ever have. I don't know and I don't care. If someone asks whether bonds will outperform stocks, just answer, I don't know and I don't care. After all, you're automatically buying both. Will healthcare stocks make high-tech stocks look sick? I don't know and I don't care. You're a permanent owner of both. What's the next Microsoft? I don't know and I don't care. As soon as it's big enough to own, your index fund will have it and you'll go along for the ride. Will foreign stocks beat US stocks next year? I don't know and I don't care. If they do, you'll capture that gain. If they don't, you'll get to buy more by enabling you to say, I don't know and I don't care, a permanent. Cast what the financial markets are about to do, and the illusion that autopilot portfolio liberates you from the feeling that you need to for lower prices. From the end of 1999 through the end of 2002, the S&P 500 stock averaged relentlessly. But if you had opened an index fund account with a $3,000 million sum investment and added $100 every month, your total outlay of $66 would have lost 30.2%, considerably less than the 41.3% plunge in the MA. Better yet, your steady buying at lower prices would build the base for an E-7 recovery when the market rebounds. Source: the Vanguard Group. Future, coupled with the acceptance of your ignorance, is a defensive. Anyone else can. The knowledge of how little you can know about the investor's most powerful weapon. Chapter 6. Portfolio Policy for the Enterprising Investor, Negative Approach. The aggressive investor should start from the same base as the defensive investor, namely, a division of his funds between high-grade bonds and high-grade common stocks bought at reasonable prices. He will be prepared to branch out into other kinds of security commitments, but in each case, he will want a well-reasoned justification for the departure. There is a difficulty in discussing this topic in orderly fashion because there is no single or ideal pattern for aggressive operations. The field of choice is wide. The selection should depend not only on the individual's competence and equipment, but perhaps equally well upon his interests. and prefer. ENSes, the most useful generalizations for the enterprising investor. R. Poor buyers. Let him also avoid inferior types of bonds. And preferred stocks unless they can be bought at bargain levels, which means ordinarily at prices at least 30% under par for high. Coupon issues, and much less for the lower coupons. He will let someone else buy foreign government bond issues, even though the yield may be attractive. He will also be wary of all kinds of new issues, including convertible bonds and preferreds that seem quite tempting, and common stocks with excellent earnings confined to the recent past. For standard bond investments, the aggressive investor would do well to follow the pattern suggested to his defensive confrere and make his choice between high-grade taxable issues, which can now be selected to yield about 7%, and good quality tax-free bonds, which yield up to 5.30% on longer maturities, second-grade bonds, and preferred stocks. Since in late minus 1971, it is possible to find first-rate corporate bonds. To yield 7% and even more, it would not make much sense to buy second-grade issues merely for the higher return they offer. In fact, corporations with relatively poor credit standing have found it virtually impossible to sell straight bonds, non-convertibles, to the public in the past 2 years. Hence, their debt financing has been done by the sale of convertible bonds or bonds with warrants attached, which place them in a separate category. It follows that virtually all the non-convertible bonds of inferior rating represent older issues which are selling at a large discount. Thus, they offer the possibility of a substantial gain in principal value under favorable future conditions, which would mean here a combination an improved credit rating for the company and lower general interest rates of. But even in the matter of price discounts and resultant chance of principal gain, the second-grade bonds are in competition with better issues. Some of the well-entrenched obligations with old-style coupon rates, 21.2% to 4%, sold at about 50 cents on the dollar in 1970. Examples: American Telephone NDAMP, Telegraph 2%, due 1986, sold at 51. Atchison Topeka NDAMP, Santa Fe RRS, due 1995, sold at 51. McGraw-Hill 3s, due 1992, sold at 50%. Hence, under conditions of late, when in 971, the enterprising investors can probably get from good grade bonds selling at a large discount all that he should reasonably desire in the form of both income and chance of appreciation. Throughout this book, we refer to the possibility that any well-defined and protracted market situation of the past may return in the future. Hence, we should consider what policy the aggressive investor might have to choose in the bond field if prices and yields of high-grade issues should return to former normals. For this reason, we shall reprint here our observations on that point made in the 1965 edition, when high-grade bonds yielded only 4%. Something should be said now about investing in second-grade issues, which can readily be found to yield any specified return up to 8% or more. The main difference between first and second-grade bonds is usually found in the number of times the interest charges have been covered by earnings. Example, in early 1964, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific 5% income debenture bonds at 68 yielded 7.35%. But the total interest charges of the road before income taxes were earned only 1.5 times in 1963, against a requirement of 5 times for a well-protected railroad issue. Many investors buy securities of this kind because they need income and cannot get along with the meager return offered by top-grade issues. Experience clearly shows that it is unwise to buy a bond or a preferred which lacks adequate safety merely because the yield is attractive. Here the word merely implies that the issue is not selling at a large discount and thus does not offer an opportunity for a substantial gain in principal value, where such securities are bought at full prices, that is, not many points under 100%, are very great that at some future time the holder will see much lower quotations. For when bad business comes or just a bad market, issues of this kind prove highly susceptible to severe sinking spells. Often interest or dividends are suspended or at least endangered, and frequently there is a pronounced price weakness even though the operating results are not at all bad. As a specific illustration of this characteristic of second quality senior issues, let us summarize the price behavior of a group of 10 railroad income bonds in 1946 to 47. These comprise all of those which sold at 96 or more in 1946, their high prices averaging 102% when two. By the following year, the group had registered low prices averaging only 68%, a loss of 1/3 of the market value in a very short time. Peculiarly enough, the railroads of the country were showing much better earnings in 1947 than in 1946. Hence, the drastic price decline ran counter to the business picture and was a reflection of the sell-off in the general market. But it should be pointed out that the shrinkage in these income bonds was proportionately larger than that in the common stocks in the Dow Jones Industrial List, about 23%. Obviously, the purchaser of these bonds at a cost above 100 could not have expected to participate to any extent enough further rise in the securities market. The only attractive feature was the income yield, averaging about 4.25%, against 2.50% for first-grade bonds, an advantage of 1.75% in annual income. Yet the sequel showed all too soon and too plainly that for the minor advantage in annual income, the buyer of these second-grade bonds was risking the loss of a substantial part of his principal. The above example permits us to pay our respects to the popular fallacy that goes under the sobriquet of a businessman's investment. That involves the purchase of a security showing a larger yield than is obtainable on a high-grade issue and carrying a correspondingly greater risk. It is bad business to accept an acknowledged possibility of a loss of principal in exchange for a mere 1 or 2% of additional yearly income, if you are willing to. Assume some risk, you should be certain that you can realize a really substantial gain in principal value if things go well. Hence, a second-grade 5.5 or 6% bond selling at par is almost always a bad purchase. The same issue at 70 might make more sense, and if you are patient, you will probably be able to buy it at that level. Second-grade bonds and preferred stocks possess two contradictory attributes which the intelligent investor must bear clearly in mind. Nearly all suffer severe sinking spells in bad markets. On the other hand, a large proportion recover their position when favorable conditions return, and these ultimately work out all right. This is true even of cumulative preferred stocks that fail to pay dividends for many years. There were a number of such issues in the early 1940s as a consequence of the long depression of the 1930s. During the post-war boom period of 1945 to 1947, many of these large accumulations were paid off either in cash or in new securities, and the principal was often discharged as well. As a result, large profits were made by people who, a few years previously, had bought these issues when they were friendless and sold at low prices. It may well be true that in an overall accounting, the higher yields obtainable on second-grade senior issues will prove to have offset those principal losses that were irrecoverable. In other words, an investor who bought all such issues at their offering prices might conceivably fare as well in the long run as one who limited himself to first-quality securities, or even somewhat better. But for practical purposes, the question is largely irrelevant. Regardless of the outcome, the buyer of second-grade issues at full prices will be worried and discommoded when their price declines precipitately. Furthermore, he cannot buy enough issues to assure his larger income to offset or amortize those principal losses, an average result, nor is he in a position to set aside a portion of, which abstain from buying securities at around 100 if long experience prove to be permanent. Finally, it is mere common sense too, indicates that they can, weak market, probably be bought at 70% or less in the next. Foreign government bonds, all investors with even small experience know that foreign bonds as a whole have had a bad investment history since 1914. This was inevitable in the light of 2 world wars and an intervening world depression of unexampled depth. Yet every few years, market conditions are sufficiently favorable to permit the sale of some new foreign issues at a price of about par. This phenomenon tells us a good deal about the working of the average investor's mind, and not only in the field of bonds. We have no concrete reason to be concerned about the future history of well-regarded foreign bonds such as those of Australia or Norway. But we do know that if and when trouble should come, the owner of foreign obligations has no legal or other means of enforcing his claim. Those who bought Republic of Cuba 41 2-seconds as high as 117 in 1953 saw them default their interest and then sell as low as 20 cents on the dollar I. And 1963. The New York Stock Exchange bond list in that year also included Belgian Congo 5% at 36, Greek 7 seconds at 30, and various issues of Poland as low as 7. How many readers have any idea of the repeated vicissitudes of the 8% bonds of Czechoslovakia since they were first offered in this country in 1922 at 961.2? They advanced to 112 in 1928, declined to 67% in 1932, recovered to 106 in 1936, collapsed to 6 in 1939, recovered unbelievably to 117 in 1946, fell promptly to 35 in 1948, and sold. As low as 8 in 1970. Years ago, an argument of sorts was made for the purchase of foreign bonds here on the grounds that a rich creditor nation such as ours was under moral obligation to lend abroad. Time, which brings so many revenges, now finds us dealing with an intractable balance of payments problem of our own, part of which is ascribable to the large-scale purchase of foreign bonds by American investors seeking a small advantage in yield. For many years past, we have questioned the inherent attractiveness of such investments from the standpoint of the buyer. Perhaps we should add now that the latter would benefit both his country and himself if he declined these opportunities. New issues generally, it might seem ill-advised to attempt any broad statements about new issues as a class, since they cover the widest possible range of quality and attractiveness. Certainly there will be exceptions to any suggested rule. Our one recommendation is that all investors should be wary of new issues, which means simply that these should be subjected to careful examination and unusually severe tests before they are purchased. There are two reasons for this double caveat. The first is that new issues have special salesmanship behind them, which calls therefore for a special degree of sales resistance. The second is that most new issues are sold under favorable market conditions, which means favorable for the seller and consequently less favorable for the buyer. The effect of these considerations becomes steadily more important as we go down the scale from the highest quality bonds through second-grade senior issues to common stock flotations. At the bottom, a tremendous amount of financing consisting auth, repayment of existing bonds at call price and their replacement by new issues with lower coupons was done in the past. Most of this was in the category of high-grade bonds and preferred stocks. The buyers would protect their interests. Hence, these offerings were carefully presetto, largely financial institutions amply qualified to pro-mengent investor, meet the going rate for comparable issues, and high-powered salesmanship had little effect on the outcome. As interest rates fell, lower and lower the buyers finally came to pay too high a price for these issues, and many of them later declined appreciably in the market. This is one aspect of the general tendency to sell new secu RIDIs of all types when conditions are most favorable to the issuer. But in the case of first quality issues, the ill effects to the purchaser are likely to be unpleasant rather than serious. The situation proves somewhat different when we study the lower grade bonds and preferred stocks sold during the 1945 to 46 and 1960 to 61 periods. Here the effect of the selling effort is more apparent because most of these issues were probably placed with individual and inexpert investors. It was characteristic of these offerings that they did not make an adequate showing when judged by the performance of the companies over a sufficient number of years. They did look safe enough for the most part, could be assumed that the recent earnings would continue without a serious setback. The investment bankers who brought out these issues presumably accepted this assumption, and their salesmen had little difficulty in persuading themselves and their customers to a like effect. Nevertheless, it was an unsound approach to investment and one likely to prove costly, if it. Bull market periods are usually characterized by the transformation of a large number of privately owned businesses into companies with quoted shares. This was the case in 1945 to 46, and again beginning in 1960. The process then reached extraordinary proportions until brought to a catastrophic close in May 1962. After the usual swearing off period of several years, the whole tragicum. Eddie was repeated step by step in 1967 to 1969. N19, new common stock offerings. The following paragraphs are reproduced unchanged from the 1959 edition, with comment added. Common stock financing takes two different forms. In the case of companies already listed, additional shares are offered pro rata to the existing stockholders. The subscription price is set below the current market, and the rights to subscribe have an initial money value. The sale of the new shares is almost always under. Written by one or more investment banking houses, but it is the general hope and expectation that all the new shares will be taken by the exercise of the subscription rights. Thus the sale of ADDI. For active selling effort on the part of distributing firms. Shall common stock of listed companies does, not ordinarily call. The second type is the placement with the public of common, if formerly privately owned enterprises, most of. Stock ofut where this stock is sold for the account of the controlling interests. 2. Enable them to cash in on a favorable market and to diversifier. Gene in VSLUT, own finances, when new money is raised for the business. EAT comes often via the sale of preferred stock, as previously noted. This activity follows a well-defined pattern which, by the nature of the security markets, must bring many losses and disappointments to the public. The dangers arise both from the character of the businesses that are thus financed and from the market conditions that make the financing possible. In the early part of the century, a large proportion of leading companies were introduced to public trading. As time went on, the number of enterprises of first rank that remained closely held steadily diminished. Hence, original common stock flotations have tended to be concentrated more and more on relatively small concerns. By an unfortunate correlation, during the same period, the stock-buying public has been developing an ingrained preference for the major companies and a similar prejudice against the minor ones. This prejudice, like many others, tends to become weaker as bull markets are built up. The large and quick profits shown by common stocks as a whole are sufficient to dull the public's critical faculty, just as they sharpen its acquisitive instinct. During these periods also, quite a number of privately owned concerns can be found that are enjoying excellent results, although most of these would not present too impressive a record if the figures were carried back, say, 10 years or more. When these factors are put together, the following consequences emerge. Somewhere in the middle of the bull market, the first common stock flotations make their appearance. These are priced not unattractively, and some large profits are made by the buyers of the early issues. As the market rise continues, this brand of financing grows more frequent. The quality of the companies becomes steadily poorer. The prices asked and obtained verge on the exorbitant. One fairly dependable sign of the approaching end of a bull swing is the fact that new common stocks of small and nondescript companies are offered at prices somewhat higher than the current level for many medium-sized companies with a long market history. It should be added that very little of this common stock financing ordinarily done by banking houses of prime size and reputation. Yes, the heedlessness of the public and the willingness of selling organizations to sell whatever may be profitably sold can have only one result: price collapse. In many cases, the new issues lose 75 and more of their offering price. The situation is worsened by the aforementioned fact that, at bottom, the public has a real aversion to the very kind of small issue that it bought so readily in its careless moments. Many of these issues fall proportionately, as much below their true value as they formerly sold above it. An elementary requirement for the intelligent investor is an ability to resist the blandishments of salesmen offering new common stock issues during bull markets. Even if one or two can be found that can pass severe tests of quality and value, it is probably bad policy to get mixed up in this sort of business. Of course, the salesman will point to many such issues which have had good-sized market advances, including some that go up spectacularly the very day they are sold. But all this is part of the speculative atmosphere. It is easy money. For every dollar you make in this way, you will be lucky if you end up by losing only 2. Some of these issues may prove excellent buys a few years later when nobody wants them, and they can be had at a small fraction of their true worth. In the 1965 edition, we continued our discussion of this subject as follows. While the broader aspects of the stock market's behavior since 1949 have lent themselves well to analysis based on long experience, the development of new common stock flotations proceeded exactly in accordance with ancient prescription. It is of such low quality and with such extreme price collapses as we, doubtful whether we ever before had so many new issues offered, the intelligent investor, experienced in 1960 to 1962. The ability of the stock market as a whole to disengage itself rapidly from that disaster is indeed an extraordinary phenomenon, bringing back long-buried memories of the similar invulnerability it showed to the great Florida real estate collapse in 1925. Must there be a return of the new stock offering madness before the present bull market can come to its definitive close? Who knows? But we do know that an intelligent investor will not forget what happened in 1962 and will let others make the next batch of quick profits in this area and experience the consequent harrowing losses. We followed these paragraphs in the 1965 edition by citing a horrible example, namely, the sale of stock of Aetna Maintenance Company at $9 in November 1961. In typical fashion, the shares promptly advanced to $15. The next year, they fell to 2%, and in 1964, too. The later history of this company was on the extraordinary side, and illustrates some of the strange metamorphoses that have taken place in American business, great and small, in recent years. The curious reader will find the older and newer history of this enterprise in Appendix 5. It is by no means difficult to provide even more harrowing examples taken from the more recent version of The Same Old Story, which covered the years 1967 to 1970. Nothing could be more. Pens to be the first company then listed in Standard Amp, Poor's Stock Guide. The shares were sold to the public at $14 in 1968, promptly advanced to $28, but in early 1971 were quoted at a dismal $25. Even this price represented a gross overvaluation of the enterprise, since it had just entered the bankruptcy court in a hopeless condition. There is so much to be learned, and such important warnings to be gleaned from the story of this flotation that we have reserved it for detailed treatment below. In Chapter 17, Commentary. On Chapter 6, the punches you miss are the ones that wear you out. Boxing trainer Angelo Dundee. For the aggressive as well as the defensive investor, what you don't do is as important to your success as what you do. In this chapter, Graham lists his don'ts for aggressive investors. Here is a list for today. Junkyard dogs, high-yield bonds, which Graham calls second grade or lower grade, and today are called junk bonds, get a brisk thumbs down from Graham. In his day, it was too costly and cumbersome for an individual investor to diversify away the risks of default, to learn how bad a default can be and how carelessly even sophisticated. Profs. CNO bond investors can buy into one, see the sidebar on P146. Today, however, more than 130 mutual funds specialize in junk bonds. These funds buy junk by the cartload. They hold dozens of different bonds. That mitigates Graham's complaints about the difficulty of diversifying. However, his bias against high-yield preferred stock remains valid, since there remains no cheap and widely available way to spread their risks has gone into default, but even after those defaults, junk bonds have, since 1978, an annual average of 4.4% of the junk bond market. 140 commentary on Chapter 6. A world of hurt for WorldCom bonds. Buying a bond only for its yield is like getting married only for the sex. If the thing that attracted you in the first place dries up, you'll find yourself asking, what else is there? When the answer is nothing, spouses and bondholders alike end up with broken hearts. On May 9, 2001, WorldCom Inc. sold the biggest offering of bonds in U.S. corporate history, $11.9 billion worth. Among the eager beavers attracted by the yields of up to 8.3% were the California Public Employees Retirement System, one of the world's largest pension funds, Retirement Systems of Alabama, whose managers later explained that the higher yields were very attractive to us at the time they were purchased, and the strong corporate bond fund, whose manager was so fond of WorldCom's fat yield that he boasted, "We're getting paid more than enough extra income for the risk." But even a 30-second glance at WorldCom's bond prospectus would have shown that these bonds had nothing to offer but their yield and everything to lose. In 2 of the previous 5 years, WorldCom's pre-tax income, the company's profits before it paid its dues to the IRS, fell short of covering its fixed charges, the cost of paying interest to its bondholders, by a stupendous $4.1 billion. WorldCom could cover those bond payments only by borrowing more money from banks. And now, with this mountainous new helping of bonds, WorldCom was fattening. Its interest cost by another $900 million per year, like Mr. Creosote and Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, WorldCom was gorging itself to the bursting point. No yield could ever be high enough to compensate an investor for risking that kind of explosion. The WorldCom bonds did produce fat yields of up to 8% for a few months. Then, as Graham would have predicted, the yield suddenly offered no shelter. WorldCom filed bankruptcy in July 2002. WorldCom admitted in August 2002 that it had overstated its earnings by more than $7 billion to 3. WorldCom's bonds defaulted when the company could no longer cover their interest charges. The bonds lost more than 80% of their original value. 1C www.calpers.ca.gov/whatsapp/hottopic/worldcomfacts.htm and www.calpers.ca.gov/whatsnew/press/a.htm. Retirement Systems of Alabama Quarterly Investment Report for May 31, 2001 at www.rsa.state.all, U.S. Investments Quarterly Report.htm, and John Bender, Strong Corporate Bond Fund Manager, quoted in www.businessweek.com/magazine/content/b37700 and 34118.htm. 2 of these numbers are all drawn from WorldCom's prospectus or sales document for the bond offering. Filed May 11, 2001, it can be viewed at www.se.gov/edgar/search-company-search.html in company name window. Enter WorldCom. Even without today's 2020's hindsight knowledge that WorldCom's earnings were fraudulently overstated, WorldCom's bond offering would have. Paul Graham. For documentation on the collapse of WorldCom, see www.worldcom.com/infodesk. Still produced an annualized return of 10.5% versus 8.6% for 10-year U.S. Treasury bonds. 2, unfortunately. Most junk bond funds charge high fees and do a poor job of preserving the original principal amount of your investment. A junk fund could be appropriate if you are retired or looking for extra monthly income to supplement your pension, and can tolerate temporary tumbles in value. If you work at a bank or other financial company, a sharp rise in interest rates could limit your raise. Or, for most other bond funds, when interest rates rise might make, even threaten your job security, so a junk fund, which tends to outper. A counterweight in your 401k, a junk bond fund, though, is Sensasa, only a minor option, not an obligation for the intelligent investor. The vodka and burrito portfolio. Graham considered foreign bonds no better a bet than junk bonds. Today, however, one variety of foreign bond may have some appeal. 4. Investors who can withstand plenty of risk, roughly a dozen. Mutual funds specialize in bonds issued in emerging market nations, or what used to be called third world countries like Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and Venezuela. No sane investor would put more than 10% off a total bond portfolio in spicy holdings like these. But emerging markets bond funds seldom move in sync with the US stock market, so they are one of the rare investments that are unlikely to drop merely because the Dow is down. That can give you a small corner off comfort in your portfolio just when you may need it most. Dying a trader's death, as we've already seen in Chapter 1, day trading holding stocks for a few hours at a time, is one of the best weapons ever invented for committing financial suicide. Some overtrades might make money, of your trades will lose money, but your broker will always make money. Most, and your own eagerness to buy or sell a stock can lower your return. Someone who is desperate to buy a stock can easily end up having to bid 10 cents higher than the most recent share price before any sellers will be willing to part with it. That extra cost, called market impact, never shows up on your brokerage statement, but it's real. If you're overeager to buy 1,000 shares of a stock and you drive its price up by just 5 cents, you've just cost yourself an invisible buffery reel, $50. On the flip side, when panicky investors are frantic to sell a stock and they dump it for less than the most recent price, market impact hits home again. The cost of trading wear away your returns like so many swipes of sandpaper. Buying or selling a hot little stock can cost 2% to 4% or 4% to 8% for a round-trip buy and sell transaction. If you put $1,000 into a stock, your trading cost could eat up roughly $40 before you even get started. Sell the stock, and you could fork over another 4% in trading expenses. Oh yes, there's one other thing. When you trade instead of invest, you turn long-term gains, taxed at a maximum capital gains rate of 20%, into ordinary income, taxed at a maximum rate of 6%. Add it all up, and a stock trader needs to gain at least 10% just to break in on buying and selling a stock. Anyone can do that once, by luck alone. To do it often enough to justify the obsessive attention it requires plus the nightmarish stress it generates is impossible. Thousands of people have tried, and the evidence is clear. The more you trade, the less you keep. Finance professors Brad Barber and Terrence Odian of the University of California examined the trading records of more than 66,000 customers of a major discount brokerage firm. From 1991 through 1996, these clients made more than 1.9 million trades before the cost of trading sandpapered away at their returns. The people in the study actually outperformed the market by an average of at least half a percentage point per year. But after trading costs the most active of, these traders who shifted more than 20% of their stock holdings per www.lo.org.month went from beating the market to underperforming it by an abysmal percentage points per year. The most patient investors, however, who traded a minuscule 0.2% of their total holdings in an average month managed to outperform the market by a whisker, even after their trading costs. Instead of giving a huge hunk of their gains away to their brokers and the IRS, they got to keep almost everything. For a look at these results, see Figure 6-1. The lesson is clear. Don't just do something. Stand there. It's time for everyone to acknowledge that the term long-term investor is redundant. A long-term investor is the only kind of investor there is. Someone who can't hold on to stocks for more than a few months. Time is doomed to end up not as a victor, but as a victim. The early bird gets wormed. Among the get-rich-quick toxins that poisoned the mind of the investing public in the 1990s, one of the most lethal was the idea that you can build wealth by buying IPOs. An IPO is an initial public offering, or the first sale of a company's stock to the public. At first blush, investing in IPO sounds like a great idea. After all, if you'd bought 100 shares of Microsoft when it went public on March 13, 1986, you're $2. 100% investment would have grown to $720,000 by early 2003. And finance professors Jay Ritter and William Schwartz have shown that if you had spread a total of only $1,000 across every IPO in January 1960 at its offering price, sold out at the end of that month, then invested anew in each successive month's crop of IPOs, your portfolio would have been worth more than $533 decillion by year-end 2001. Patient. Researchers Brad Barber and Terence Odian divided thousands of traders into 5 tiers based on how often they turned over their holdings. Those who traded the least at the left kept most of their gains, but the impatient and hyperactive traders made their brokers rich, not themselves. The bars at the far right show a market index fund for comparison. Source: Profs. Brad Barber, University of California at Davis, and Terence Odian, Univer. City of California at Berkeley. Unfortunately, for every IPO like Microsoft that turns out will be a big winner, there are thousands of losers. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have shown when humans estimate the likelihood or frequency of an event, we make that judgment based not on how often the event has actually occurred, but on how vivid the past. Examples are, we all want to buy the next Microsoft precisely because we know we missed buying the first Microsoft. But we conveniently overlook the fact that most other IPOs were terrible investments. You could have earned that $533 decillion gain only if you never missed a single one of the IPO market's rare winners a practi. Commentary on chapter Occal Impossibility. Finally, most of the high returns on IPOs are captured by members of an exclusive private club, the big investment banks, and fund houses that get shares at the initial, or underwriting, price. Before the stock begins public trading, the biggest run-ups often occur in stocks so small that even many big investors can't get any shares. There just aren't enough to go around. If, like nearly every investor, you can get access to IPOs only after their shares have rocketed above the exclusive initial price, your results will be terrible. From 1980 through 2001, if you had bought the average IPO at its first public closing price and held on for 3 years, you would have underperformed the market by more than 23 percentage points annually. Perhaps no stock personifies the pipe dream of getting rich from IPOs better than VIA Linux. LNUX, the next MSFT, exalted an early owner. Buy now and retire in 5 years from now. 10%. On December 9th, 1999, the stock was placed at an initial public offering price of $30. But demand for the shares was so ferocious that when NASDAQ opened that morning, none of the initial owners off of Linux would let go of any shares until the price hit $299. The stock peaked at $320 and closed at $239.25, a gain of 697.5% in a single day. But that gain was earned by only a handful of institutional traders. Individual investors were almost entirely frozen out. More important, buying IPOs is a bad idea because it flagrantly violates one of Graham's most fundamental rules. No matter how many other people want to buy a stock, you should buy only if the stock is a cheap way to own a desirable business. At the peak price on day one, investors were valuing VIA Linux's shares at a total of $12.7 billion. What was the company's business worth? Less than 5 years old, VIA Linux had sold a cumulative total of $44 million worth of its software and services, but had lost $25 million in the process. In its most recent fiscal quarter, VIA Linux had generated $15 million in sales, but www.leo.org had lost $10 million on them. This business then was losing almost 70 cents on every dollar it took in. VIA Linux's accumulated deficit, the amount by which its total expenses had exceeded its income, was $30 million. If VIA Linux were a private company owned by the guy who lives next door, and he leaned over the picket fence and asked you how much you would pay to take his struggling little business off his hands, you answer, oh, $12.7 billion sounds about right to me? Or would you instead smile politely, turn back to your barbecue grill, and wonder what on earth your neighbor had been smoking? Relying exclusively on our own judgment, none of us would be caught dead, agreeing to pay nearly $13 billion for a money loser that was already $30 million in the hole. But when we're in public instead of in private, when valuation suddenly becomes a popularity contest, the price of a stock seems more important than the value of the business it represents. As long as someone else will pay even more than you did for a stock, why does it matter what the business is worth? This chart shows why it matters. Figure www.lo.org. After going up like a bottle rocket on that first day of trading Virginia, Linux came down like a buttered brick. By December 9th, 2002, 3 years to the day after the stock was at $239.50, Virginia Linux closed at $1.19 per share. Weighing the evidence objectively, the intelligent investor should conclude that IPO does not stand only for initial public offering. More accurately, it is also shorthand for it's probably overpriced imaginary profits only, insider's private opportunity, or idiotic, preposterous, and outrageous